Beyond the Fence Line, a podcast brought to you by the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Created by landowners for landowners, we're proud to play a role in conserving the Texas legacy of wide open spaces.
Well, welcome back to Beyond the Fence Line, a podcast brought to you by the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Whether you're a landowner, a producer, conservation professional, or someone who cares about the future of Texas working lands, we're glad you are here. I'm Chad Ellis. I'm the CEO of TALT, and thanks for joining us. Today, I'm joined by my good friend, Tiffany Lashmet, an agricultural law specialist with Texas A&M, AgriLife Extension, nationally recognized speaker, author of Texas Agricultural Law blog, and host of Ag Law in the Field podcast. Tiffany spends much of her time helping farmers, ranchers, families navigate the legal issues that come with owning land, from water law, grazing laws, carbon, markets, you name it, she's the go-to. And Tiffany, it's so great to have you join us today.
Yeah, absolutely, Chad. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
One of our greatest challenges we face in Texas today isn't just this rapid growth and development, that we're seeing everywhere and this pressure, but it's really around this generational transition. We're in the largest transfer of farms and ranches, and it's happening now. We'll see the largest transfer of wealth our nation's ever seen in the next 5 years, and it's just amazing to me.
That's right, Chad. It's interesting. Like, I do a lot of producer programs, right, for landowners and ag producers, and you look around the room and you think, gosh, in 10 years, the statistics tell us a lot of these people won't be here anymore, right? We've got a lot of 70, 80, 90-year-olds in the audience, and you think about the stewardship knowledge, that kind of stuff, just the land that's going to transfer or be lost. I think that we're really at kind of a critical point here.
We're seeing it and have been seeing it the last few years at TALT. We help provide tool in the toolbox for, potentially for some families. And as you're thinking around this transition, and it's definitely this eye-opening to me. You hit the age of 70 and you flip a switch and it's like, okay, this is time we have to really kind of start figuring out this future and what that looks like. And so I'm glad, I think timing is perfect for us to sit down and dive into some of these deep conversations and be able to help, bring some of the right tools and ideas.
That's right. Nobody wants to think about dying, right? That overall is really a complex situation. I think a lot of folks have real questions about what happens to the land after they're gone. And maybe if they don't know what that looks like, I think that's scary. Then loop in the fact that you need to go hire a lawyer to do some of this. None of that sounds enjoyable. So it makes sense, right? That people are kind of hesitant to get started.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about succession plan, we're really talking about passing on this asset. But also, what about this other knowledge, the stewardship, and what does that look like? How do we structure and work these deals beyond just the asset itself?
Yeah, and I think that's really a critical piece to this that we're probably not the best at always recognizing. I like to think about, we'll call it transition planning, overarching thing. There's really two pieces there. One piece is what I'm going to call estate planning, the actual transfer of the asset. What does the will say? Who's going to own it? How does that process play out? And that is hugely important, obviously, from a legal perspective. But there's also what you want to call the succession plan, which is who's going to come in and take this over and be able to continue the operation. And that's a lot different than who might own it on paper, right? But who actually understands the property, the land, the business operation. Who's going to make those management decisions? Who's going to know when something's right or wrong? All those sort of things. Like I said, because that's not maybe as cut and dry as whose name goes on the deed, it's a little fuzzier to figure some of that out. And I think a lot of times we overlook that. And it's a really critical piece to making sure that we have a successful plan to transition this land to the next generation.
When you were saying that, I was thinking about, this was a number of years ago, Debbie Lyons Blythe. She's a cow-calf producer in Kansas. And Debbie and I were tag teaming a presentation, and we were talking about grazing management plans. And she was talking about the importance of it from her perspective. And the importance was really about this succession. She's like, this knowledge that my husband and I have been doing for years, and what happens if we get run over in the pens working cattle the next time and we're both out of the picture? what are the kids going to do, right? And understanding that it's not just some of these plans in our heads, but she's like, it's really important to have it written down. And I think there's things that we need to step back and think about. As Debbie mentioned, it really was an eye opener to me in her conversation of there's a lot of things that we do and we take for granted because we know it and it's in our head. And there's important, I think, part of, like you're mentioning, the succession, the stewardship, and how do we pass that knowledge down, that we need to pause and really, truly write it down.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Write it down and then also start training the next generation right now. While you're here, well, you can impart some of that knowledge. Our family operation might be a good example. We have a farm and ranch out in New Mexico. My grandparents started that, and then my dad lost his father when he was 13 years old. And so when he was 13, my dad stepped up and started taking over and running the farming and ranching operation along with my uncle and my grandmother. And my dad's never left, right? He's been on that ranch for his entire life. I grew up there. I'm still very involved, but I don't know all the day to day that my dad knows. And so start having those conversations, start teaching now while you're still here, because what a huge loss it is to the family and the operation if that knowledge dies with the older generation.
Yeah, that's spot on. For many of these ranchers, the land's not just an investment, it's really part of who they are as a family and as a core. How does this emotional connection affect thinking about this planning?
Actually, this is as big of an effect as anything on farm and ranch estate planning, is this concept of the legacy here, right? It's not just the asset, it's not just the business, it's a legacy that they have built. I've given presentations to estate planning attorneys before who didn't specialize in agriculture, and I really focus on this because I try to explain this is where your ag clients, especially those intergenerational ones, are so different than the other business owner who walks in off the street. And the importance of that can't really be overstated. The other thing I'll tell you is that really does add a whole nother layer of pressure to some of these decisions. And so you think about if you're somebody who maybe the succession plan is we're going to sell the farm. We've come to the end of when our family's going to own it. The decision we're going to make is to sell it. That can be a very difficult decision to make because, like we talked about, there's this emotional connection. There's this legacy. What if you don't want to sell it and you wish your heirs wanted to come back and they don't? That's a whole nother layer. So I just think there's a lot of complexity there. And, you don't need to sit with a lawyer to sort it out, but that's some of the stuff that in your own mind, in your own time, you need to really think through and analyze.
Yeah, another friend of mine, Cole Manick, there in Montana, they have some restaurants and cow-calf operation as well. And in their restaurant, you walk in and they have land is kin. And most people don't understand that until you said it's multi-generation. I also think of David Langford when we did a conservation easement with David, and he kind of made this deal. He's like, the land has a seat at the table now with that conservation easement, right? It's because it is family, right? It's another family member that has a seat at the table that's part of these decisions as we think of this legacy, this heritage as that moves forward, which it's just more complicated.
It is, yeah. And like I say, it's something that you need to take some time and think through and kind of know in your own head where you are with that. I don't think there's a right or wrong place to be, but got a seat at the table and you need to kind of analyze through that.
Yeah. Well, kind of dive in, and this is a question I've been asked before. If you could eliminate one piece of advice that gets repeated about succession planning because it's incomplete or misleading, what would it be?
I'm going to give you two, and then I would like to hear your answer too, Chad, because I'm interested in what you would have to say. The first one, I'm not sure it's really advice, but it's sort of an attitude that goes around, and that is the attitude of, I'm not going to worry about any of this. I'll be dead, and they can figure it out. That is the absolute worst thing you can do for your family, for your land, for your legacy. So we've got to get rid of that attitude. Not having a plan at all is absolutely setting yourself up for failure. And you're not doing the generations any favors by putting it all on them. I understand in the past this wasn't the case, but at least now with the laws that we have regarding the federal estate tax, I think that a lot of people will come in and think that they need some really complex estate plan to avoid the estate tax, and they're going to spend all this money setting up something super complicated and multiple layers and a big complex trust when maybe the estate tax was never a problem for them. Maybe the bad advice is just folks that are trying to sell you a big complex plan if you don't need one. Maybe you do. Some of the top clients you have, I know, need very complex, difficult plans. My family doesn't, right? And so I just think when you're working with a lawyer, I'd really make sure whatever they're trying to convince you to do, that they've explained to you the reason why you need that.
Seems like whenever we get close to a administration change during
Yes.
that election, it seems like the pressure ramps up. There's a lot of what ifs. I've seen many families make it too complicated, as you mentioned, and do things ahead of time that maybe wasn't the right thing, and sometimes is more costly than trying to fix it.
Yeah. The other thing is the law is not just what you read on Facebook. Maybe that should have been my answer.
Yeah.
You'll see stuff on Facebook and I'm just like beating my head against the law because I'm like, that is not true. And so really knowing the law and really having good counsel is also important to the point you made.
Yeah. We think about 30 years ago, the economics of agriculture. We think about it today. It's totally different. And how does that play into this aspect of thinking around succession planning?
There's so many things that are different. Just the value of assets is one good example, right? Look at Texas. The land value increase over the last 30 years is astronomical. And all of a sudden that can really change the type of plan that you need to have because of the value of that asset. Maybe 30 years ago, the asset wasn't worth that much. It wasn't that big of a deal. Now you got land in the hill country. It's huge, right? Same thing, even with like equipment and implements. We talk all the time about the value of a farm or a ranch being a multi-million-dollar business. And somebody one time kind of said, oh, we're not multi-million dollars. I said, I know you own a cotton stripper. Well, those stripper balers cost $750,000. So yes, you are. It just, the economics changing, the values increasing has a big impact. On the flip side of that, I also think that the increase in input costs make it a difficult business to be in sometimes, right? Farming and ranching from a profit perspective can be really difficult. And I think that's an important consideration when you're trying to figure out, can your kids come back? Can they afford to come back? Can the ranch afford for them to come back? You need to be thinking through some of those economics just of the ranch. And so whether it's an economist or an accountant or a financial advisor or whatever, working through and really understanding the finances is a key part to getting to the right estate and succession plan.
In that same situation, and I've seen this a number of times, you make decisions, you're trying to do that good planning and you're thinking through, and maybe you have two children and you're thinking, okay, well, one will come back. How do you handle this with neither one? This is the unfortunate, one of the problems and layers we have in this industry. Most of the time, our farms and ranches can only support one family, right? Of course, you want the legacy, you want your children to come back, and a lot of times they want to early on, and then 30 years come by and then it's time to hand over and they're sort of, too invested in their career or can't. So how do we handle that, or what are those options for folks to think through that? Because I think that's reality.
I think it's certainly reality for a lot of folks that live in real rural places, right? I mean, it's a hard sell, right? My small town in New Mexico that barely has a grocery store. We're an hour and a half from a Walmart. There's like one doctor there. It's a hard sell that I'm going to move my young family back there and this is all going to work out and be great. I completely get the discussion. The first thing we need to recognize is that's a difficult place to be for the older generation. But because of that legacy that we talked about, they've worked their whole lives, blood, sweat, and tears to build this legacy. And now maybe there's not somebody who's going to come back. And so, number one, that is a difficult thing. And I think it's okay if it feels like a difficult thing. Number two, there are some ways to get creative with estate and succession plans that might allow sort of a more out of the box type of approach. Maybe the kids can't come back, but maybe they could still own that land. Could you set up a lease type situation for them? Could a conservation easement be an option for them? Could there be a different type of income generation source on the ranch? Whether that's, something like wind energy, or is there oil and gas opportunities? Sometimes pipeline easements, lots of options to look into. Like, is there a way to keep the land if that's something that the family wants to do without somebody living here? I think think about that from the other side. If you're the young producer who's trying to get into agriculture and maybe can't afford to buy land, gosh, what a gift it would be to land yourself in a situation where maybe you could manage this for people who care about it but can't move home. It can be a win-win for both people sometimes. So I think that's always a good option to look for.
Yeah, I think there's options, right? Sometimes it's God's plans. And not ours like we want. And we just got to find the good and still meet those family wishes as we move forward.
And the important thing there is be willing to be creative. It doesn't have to look
Yeah.
like what it's always looked like,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that's an important thing to remember.
It's not a cookie cutter. It's not what your neighbor did or another family member.
Right.
But what would you say some of the things that are often overlooked to a good succession plan?
So I think a couple of things I would highlight. One thing, and this may seem obvious, but it can catch you, make sure that all of your beneficiary designations are up to date.
Yeah.
Right? I think a lot of times we think about the estate or succession plan and we think, okay, we have to have a will, we have to have a plan for what kids moving home, we have to whatever. But a lot of people hold a lot of their valuable assets not in something that would pass through the will, right? It'd be a non-probate asset. Things like 401ks or investment accounts, life insurance. For some people, the biggest bulk of their assets pass outside that will. Make sure those designations are up to date. That's something I think a lot of people overlook. Another thing that can be overlooked is if you're going to leave the land to multiple heirs. I'm not going to say never, but almost never is the best plan to leave it to them outright as joint owners. It's what we call tenants in common. And the reason that is kind of a dangerous plan is because of something called partition. What that means is in Texas, we're not going to force people to own land together. If somebody wants out of joint ownership, they can go to court and seek partition to get out of that. What that means is they essentially ask the court to divvy that land up into pieces, and they would each own their own piece instead of their percentage of the whole. And that's all well and good if the court can draw lines and divide them up into exactly equal pieces. I'll let you guess how often land can be split into exactly equal pieces. And in that situation, there can end up being a partition by sale where the land is actually sold, and if the other heirs want to try to buy it, they're scrambling to try to figure out how to do that. So I think we overlook the threat of partition. Lots of ways to plan around that. A good lawyer can help you. Leave it to all the kids in an LLC, and we can avoid that issue. But that's something we don't think about enough as landowners. The third thing I would say there is capital gains taxes. And interestingly enough, we hear a lot of talk about the concern about estate taxes. But I actually think for most intergenerational ranches, the bigger threat is capital gains if that land gets sold one day. And so I always encourage folks to make sure you understand the impacts of how and when you transfer the land to the next generation on those capital gains taxes. That's where you want to be talking to a lawyer, an accountant before you take action.
Yeah, that was good. I do want to dive in a little bit more. It's really about the conversation, and it's not a cookie cutter. Not every family's the same. I mean, how do you start that conversation?
Right. That's the important piece is you got to start it before we have a crisis on our hands, right? You don't want to have that conversation in the hospital or in the funeral home. So I would just encourage people, let's start talking now. Another thing I think is important to hear is this probably won't be a one-time conversation. We're not going to all sit down at the table. Probably, maybe your family's more efficient than mine, okay? We certainly didn't sit down at the table and come out with a fully written, executed plan. We talked about ours for a couple of years, but we had that initial discussion of what does this look like? What's everybody thinking? What are your interests in the farm? What are your goals long-term? And that got the ball rolling. And then throughout the next few years, every now and again, it would come up and we'd talk about, well, what if we did this? Or what do you think about that? So I would say the biggest thing is just get started, right? Start having some conversation. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know what this looks like, but just starting to talk about it. You got to start with getting the conversation rolling.
I think one of the questions that's probably the hardest for most families, probably harder for some than others, is whether treating the children equally is fair, right? How do you see successful families navigate this?
The first thing, which you've said this a million times, this may be the title of the episode, I don't know, but it's not a cookie cutter. There's no right answer. If you've got kids and you want to leave it to them exactly equally, you get to make that decision. If you've got kids and you don't want to leave it to them equally, for whatever reason, you get to make that decision. It comes up a lot, Chad, when we've got one on-farm heir and one off-farm heir.
Right. Absolutely.
What do we do? Historically, we've seen a lot of folks who've taken the approach, will you leave it to them half and half, and you let the on-farm heir buy out the off-farm heir. From an economics perspective, that's typically a disaster.
Yeah, it worked.
Most of these farms and ranches can only pay for themselves sometimes once. Sure can't do it twice. And in order to go get more money to try to do that, the
Yeah.
kid at home isn't liquid. There's no liquidity there. And so that one maybe isn't always the best plan. I've seen a lot of people have success with life insurance policies. They'll buy a life insurance policy and they'll put the off-farm kid as the beneficiary, and they make the value of that equivalent or as close as they can to the value of the farm. And now each kid gets something. We've treated them closely fair, but we've kind of protected the farm for the kid who's there. So there's lots of options. Again, LLCs can be a tool to deal with that. There's lots of options if we're willing to kind of be creative and come up with a plan. But again, the first decision's got to be, how do we want to do this? And there's not a right or a wrong answer.
I think it's a great idea on the life insurance and how to structure that. A lot of times we see, and we'll throw it as another idea for families we're working with that decide to do a conservation easement, especially if we do a purchased conservation easement. A lot of times we'll see families take that value and then actually build a operational endowment. So when that one that's on the farm working calls their sibling and says, "Hey, the water well's out. I need you to send me a check for 10,000." And they're, that's where the conflicts start really happening. And so it just really helps.
And that's a great example of thinking outside the box. My grandma never would have come up with that, but there are tools like that now.
Yeah, absolutely. The next generation is not just inheriting the land, right, and that asset. They're inheriting, some of the heartaches too, the drought, the water challenges that we're having, development pressure, the changing in the markets. How should resilience become part of that succession plan?
I think the topic of resilience is one that's probably not talked about enough. One thing I think is important is for us to just have a conversation and talk about it. I just work in the mental health space and we talk about some of this there too, but I think it's helpful if you are the older generation now, talk to your kids and your grandkids about the struggles that you've had, right? Talk to them about what it was like when the drought hit in 2012 and everything went to absolute crap and you had to sell a bunch of the cows. Let them know how that felt, how you got through it, what decisions you made that worked, what didn't work. Here's where I struggled. Here's what we figured out. Here's how we got through it. I think it lets people know that they're not alone. So next time there's a terrible drought and it's your grandkids running the ranch, they're not thinking, my gosh, nobody else struggled like this. I'm doing it wrong, right? They're thinking, my gosh, my grandpa got through this. I can do it too, right?
What about, you kind of mentioned this earlier in our conversation, these families that don't have heirs, have put blood, sweat, and tears building this operation, that legacy is part of them, right? And very much so, and should be. We're having more conversations around this and love your thoughts, what that looks like for them.
Yeah. One thing that probably is important there is trying to parse out the difference between this land owned and operated like it is now and our legacy. This land may be part of our legacy. I don't think it's our entire legacy. And so I think parsing that out, right, is probably really important. The other thing I think too, if you're somebody who really views that land as your legacy, right? And I sympathize with this because I get this. My grandparents, my dad, my mom, all the blood, sweat, tears, sacrifice that went into that. It's very difficult for me to think, well, we'll just sell it. They'll pave it over into a parking lot, right? But again, there's a lot of tools that you can use to prevent that might not look like you moving home and raising cattle like mom and dad. Conservation easement, perfect example. Maybe that's a tool where you can preserve the legacy. Maybe your kids are still going to live in Chicago, but man, you can preserve that legacy of that land right here in Texas, and they can still be a part of that even though they're not here and managing it or whatever they're doing. Again, I really am a believer in the long-term lease agreement. I think that can be really helpful for the next generation of agriculture. And again, now your legacy extends beyond your family. Maybe your legacy extends to this other family who's getting involved. So there are different ways to look at it when we really start to parse it out. And I think taking some time to do that might be beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, no, that's your aspect of land and legacy, you articulated that well. And I think that's where we get hung up.
What do you tell people in that situation? I know you deal with that all the time.
We have these conversations. And one of the things is that, I've been thinking on this for a number of years, and we're starting to kind of build this kind of new program around this, what we're calling our land legacy program at Talt. And so there's these families that don't have heirs. They could gift the land to Talt. We're not going to own land. That's kind of our core principles. We want land stewards, but maybe we could provide an opportunity in that we could have a creative finance model and be able to sell that to a new land steward. We wouldn't sell it as, the highest bidder on the market. We would actually kind of have an interview process and understand the wishes of those landowners and find that. And I think give some assurance to that family that Talt is there, as a key partner to help facilitate and help the next steward that's going to, love and take care of their property as they did. As we talked about, if you're a new beginning farmer or veteran coming in and wanting to, and it's like, how do I get into the business? I can't afford it. This could be a creative way that we could, keep the land being productive and providing for that family, but also what a great legacy in that. So just another option that we're trying to, really think through, and we're not 100% there. And it's having these conversations and trying to put the puzzle pieces together. And again, I think a lot of this is what we've talked about is just thinking outside the box and thinking of new models. And again, that model's not going to fit everyone. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely one that we've had a number of families really start thinking through, and us also thinking through of how that would look.
Yeah, I think that's great.
How does succession planning and how does this all tie back to conservation? And what's your thoughts around?
Again, it depends on the family. It depends on the plan. But if we don't have a plan, I think a lot of times what happens is that lands on the auction block to the highest bidder. And right now in rural America, the highest bidder is probably not a conservation steward that's looking to take care of the land. And so making sure that we have a succession plan and making sure that we are making decisions and plans to try and protect the land, to try to ensure good stewardship, right? That can be an important piece of the succession planning process. If we just leave it to fate or leave it to, free markets, economics, conservation is not going to win out, right? And so I think, again, when we're talking about the importance of having a plan, gosh, there's a perfect example of why you need one. Because without it, we're losing, I don't know, you probably know the stats.
1,023 acres a day.
A day. If we don't have a plan in place that prioritizes things like conservation and stewardship, that number is going to just keep going up.
Yeah. Kind of maybe shift conversation a little bit. And it's one of those things we potentially could overlook. To me, it's always like for us to stay in business, we have to have a diverse operation, different income streams. I'm thinking of like ecosystem service markets, carbon markets, water markets, these other type of financial streams coming in than just our traditional ag product. How do we plan around that for that next generation, making sure they're aware, if we're looking at a potential water market or carbon market, what are the key things we need to think about part of the succession and, next generation if we may not be around for 10, 20 years as that contract's in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is an important thing for, like you said, kind of those, let's call them ecosystem service contracts. Also for other types of contracts, right? Long-term leases, easements, solar, wind, all of that. All this comes into play. If you're in your 70s or 80s and we're signing 20, 30, 40-year contracts, that contract is part of your succession plan, whether you think of it like that or not. And that's something I really encourage folks is when you're entering into some sort of long-term agreement, that needs to be a conversation not just for you, but also with your heirs. How is that going to impact them? What do they think about that? Do they need to change some of their plans or decisions based on those type of contracts? So I think that's number one, is just viewing it as part of a succession plan. Number two, I always encourage people when you're looking at any type of contract like that that's going to affect your use of your land, you need to be very clear on the exact limitations you're placing on the land. And those limitations may be fine with you, but you've got to make sure you understand them. Because I can't tell you how many folks will sign a contract and take that money, and then they come back and they're like, you have got to be kidding me. They're saying I can't do X, Y, Z. Well, yeah, it's written in bold print on paragraph 7, but you didn't read it. And so I think being really careful to understand the impact that something has on your land. You know that I do this. I tell people the same thing with a conservation easement, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Make sure you understand what impact that has on your land. Know what the definitions mean. Know, how long it lasts, exactly what you can and can't do. I think making sure you really understand the ins and outs is really something that folks need to do, and probably we don't do well enough.
Well, if every Texas landowner was listening today and they were going to implement one thing in the next 6 months, what is that one thing that they should do?
The lawyer in me wants to say they should be talking to a lawyer
Yeah.
and getting this all done, right? But I'm going to step back from that for a minute. What I'm going to tell you is you've got to start thinking about some of this and having the conversations. Start thinking realistically about what this might look like. Start thinking realistically about what your heirs' interests and ask them about it, right?
Yeah.
Gauge their interests, their goals, their ability to be involved. We talked about, start parsing out this concept of legacy and land and how that all, and the family and how that all relates together. I just think spending some time on doing that kind of work is really going to pay off in the long run. But get started, get started today. And that's one point I did want to make, Chad. You said this earlier, you kind of hit 70 and everybody's like, oh my gosh, I probably need an estate plan. If you're 18 years old, you need an estate plan, right? You need a will, you need those basic documents. Once you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, you're acquiring land, you're operating, you're doing these things, you need an estate plan. 60, 70, 80, you need an estate plan, right? Because we just don't know what might happen. And again, not having a plan in place doesn't only do a disservice to the land, it does a disservice to your family as well. So I would just encourage everybody to get started.
No plan in place is a plan to fail. And it's going to happen every time. That's the unfortunate. And I think, too, as you run across the same mentality of we'll let them figure it out, and that's being selfish.
I've heard it described this way, and I think this is right. What it is, it's a difficult decision. And instead of you making that difficult decision, you're forcing that on your kids. Don't do that. You don't want to leave them with a decision you thought was too hard to make.
Yeah.
But step up and make the difficult decision for the benefit of the next generations.
You think about Texas, and we talked about some of the pressures, losing 1,023 acres, 1,400 people move into the state daily. You think about Texas 50 years from now, what gives you hope?
Gosh, I think what gives me hope is the people that love this way of life. I think about my folks and our neighbors and my grandma, my grandfather died when she was in her 40s. She had a teaching job in town and 2 teenage boys to raise. The easy thing was selling that farm, right? She didn't. And gosh, my kids just spent the last week there with their grandparents, working sheep and irrigating and all those kinds of things. So I just think that the people that love this way of life give me hope. That's why I just want to encourage people, make the hard decisions. Part of loving this way of life and wanting to see it continue is making the hard decisions, having the hard conversations. Because if we do that, I think we still have a lot of hope here that this lifestyle and the way we live is going to continue.
I agree with you. When you go to these events and see these kids, future generations that still love it, I mean, it makes you smile and know that we'll be fine. Yeah, I want to give you a little bit of time too, and I know this is another passion of yours as well as mine, and you kind of talked a little bit about it or brought it up in our conversation already, is around mental health and these decisions, and I'd love for you to kind of talk about some of your work and some of that, because it's important.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. It is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'll give you a little bit of background as to why. When I was 14 years old, I lost a good friend of mine to suicide. And you just kind of never recover from that, right? It's just something that doesn't ever go away. Over the years, I've lost a couple other good family friends who were involved in agriculture, right? Just ranchers, great people. Some of my favorite people have suffered with mental health challenges, and at least one has died by suicide as well. And this is the first time I'll talk about this. I lost a dear friend about 2 weeks ago to suicide. And so it's just something that keeps plaguing not only me and the people that I love, but also rural America, right? And agriculture. And gosh, I think about 10 years ago, we didn't talk about this, right? You and I on this podcast, this wouldn't have ever come up. At producer meetings, you'd never see a mental health session. You'd never see somebody talk about depression or suicide on the stage. And I think that's changed some. We're starting to see these conversations. And I think it's because people are tired of their friends and family dying. And so I think that there's some hope in that. The work that I've been involved in is here at Texas A&M. It's through a project we call Farm Hope. And what we do is we've partnered up with the Texas A&M Telehealth Institute, and we actually offer free counseling services. They're on the phone or the computer, so telehealth services to anybody in Texas that's involved in agriculture or their family members. So if there's anybody out there who, and listen, it may very well be that trying to figure out your succession plan
Absolutely.
led you to need to talk to somebody, right? Anybody who needs that, whether you think you're depressed or, like I say, you want to sort through some of this in your own brain about legacy, right? You can call our Farm Hope number. We have a counselor in College Station who's got an agriculture background and a real heart for agriculture. It's free. There's no referrals. There's no doctor's note. We don't do insurance. You just call and set up an appointment. She'll talk to you as many times as you need to and help walk you through that. So, I guess kind of in honor of the people who I've loved and lost, that's a project I'm glad to be a part of. And I hope that it helps others who maybe find themselves struggling and don't know where to turn.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it. I know you're honoring all of them, and appreciate that. And something, you and I've talked about this over a number of years because I've had sort of the same situations. And I remember this probably 6-7 years ago when the National Grazing Land Coalition, we had a conference, and our opening session, it was a piece around this.
Yes.
And at that time was kind of some of the first to, especially in the opening.
Yes.
But, it definitely helped many people already in that audience, and just been something that's dear to me, and appreciate all your work in that. Well, Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us. And succession planning isn't always, an easy topic or know where to start. And you definitely gave us that aspect of just start having those conversations is a key point, and important for us, in that investment into the next generation and the assets of our working lands for our families and future families and all Texans in general. So again, thank you so much for all you do and helping us landowners.
Yeah, Chad, thank you so much for the work that you guys do. I mean, super helpful for folks who are interested in conservation easements, but even beyond that, for people who are just interested in stewardship and conservation here in Texas. I know you guys are a great resource for everybody. So I appreciate the work that you all do in this space as well.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for listening today. And if you'd like to learn more about Texas Agricultural Land Trust around conservation easements or other tools in that toolbox that may help you and help your family create that lasting land legacy, visit us online at txaglandtrust.org or contact us through our social media. And again, look for Tiffany's blog and all of her resources. Will definitely help you and your families as you're kind of thinking through your succession and what that means for you. So until next time, thanks for listening to Beyond the Fence Line.
Beyond the Fence Line is brought to you by the Texas Agricultural Land Trust, dedicated to conserving the Texas heritage of agricultural lands, wildlife habitats, and natural resources. Find out more at txaglandtrust.org.